With this panel, we're going to hear from some of the folks that help Montana small businesses access federal programs and help these businesses succeed. We'll also hear from some of the folks who provide capital to these firms to enable them to take their business to the next level. And we'll hear about some of the opportunities and challenges facing innovative small businesses. I'll quickly introduce the panel, and then we'll start with Dr. Swearingen. Dr. Will Swearingen is Executive Director of the Tech Link Center here in Bozeman. Good to have you here, Will. Marty Elder is a counselor with the Montana Innovation Partnership in Helena, Montana. Marty, thank you. John O'Donnell, a founder of Tech Ranch, partner at Montlake Capital, is a Montana representative for the Rocky Mountain Venture Capital Association. Thank you for being here, John. Evan Barrett, Chief Business Officer from the Governor's Office of Economic Development, who also works on the Governor's Innovate Montana initiative. Thank you, Evan. And we have John Tyler, Vice President and General Counsel of the Kauffman Foundation, a foundation devoted to entrepreneurship, joining us here from Kansas City today. Thanks for making the trip, John. We appreciate that. Thank you. And finally, we have Trevor Lloyd, General Partner of Flywheel Ventures in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a venture capital firm focused on investing in the Mountain West, and that does include Montana. So thank you for being here today, Trevor. We appreciate it. And we'll start with you, Will, and then head down the list. So how about it? Will Swearingen.
Thank you, John. As John said, I'm the director of TechLink. We're a federally funded tech transfer center at Montana State University. We've been engaged in federal tech transfer since 1996, first with NASA and more recently with the Department of Defense. And I'd like to make two major points today. First of all, that federal tech transfer is already an important contributor to the nation's economy. But secondly, with some strategic policy changes, and I'll make one of those, I believe that federal tech transfer could be a truly dynamic engine of economic growth in the United States. Just to give you a sense of the landscape, there are approximately 1,000 federal labs around the country, NASA, DOD, NIH, et cetera. Each year these labs expend roughly $35 billion within their own walls on research and development, and they generate about 1,500 patented inventions a year. They're mandated by Congress to try to transfer their inventions to industry as a way to spur economic growth and create jobs. TechLink for the last 12 years has been helping the Department of Defense with its tech transfer. In fact, we're the primary outside center, tech transfer center for the Department of Defense. Our main activity is helping companies to license DoD inventions. TechLink for the last 7 years has brokered over half of the Department of Defense's licensing agreements with U.S. industry. Now, we know firsthand that this does have an effect on the economy. It creates economic growth and jobs. In 2009, the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana looked at TechLink's economic impacts at the behest of the Department of Defense. They looked at our agreements, tech transfer agreements for DoD, most of these before 2007, and they found that these agreements and the results from them were equivalent to $729 million in new sales and economic output, and that these agreements had contributed to the formation of 4,300 jobs nationwide, high-tech jobs. Now, we believe that these results are fairly representative of federal tech transfer. However, these outcomes could be greatly expanded. The problem is, and the fact is, that federal labs greatly underperform just as a measure U.S. universities. They underperform both in developing new patented inventions and in transferring these inventions to industry. If you look at this on a per dollar expenditure basis, you see that federal labs are only about 1/3 to 1/4 as productive as U.S. universities. Why is that? Well, the basic problem is that federal tech transfer is a congressional mandate, but it's an unfunded mandate. So it's mandated by U.S. legislation, but it's funded at only a bare bones level by the federal labs themselves. Most federal tech transfer offices are understaffed. As a result, many of the lab's inventions go unnoticed and unpatented, and those inventions that do get patented tend to lie fallow, essentially collecting dust on lab shelves. What's the solution? Well, one effective solution would be to require all federal labs to designate a small fraction of their R&D budgets for technology transfer. A federal working group has suggested that 1.5% of their federal tech transfer budgets, their R&D budgets, would be a reasonable minimum level of funding. Now, importantly, in this economic climate, it's very important to note that this proposed 1.5% allocation would not require any new funding. It would simply require that federal agencies spend the necessary funds to protect their inventions and to move these inventions out of the labs and into the marketplace, in partnership, of course, with the private sector. So I believe that this policy change alone would help the U.S. taxpayer to reap much more of the benefits of the federal investment in its federal labs, and it would enable these federal labs to play a much more prominent role in the U.S. economy, helping them to create jobs and start up companies, and helping the U.S. to retain its international economic competitiveness. So I'd like to conclude by thanking you, Senator Tester, for holding this important roundtable, and I have some supporting materials that I'll give to your staff.
Well, thank you, Will, and we'll flesh out some more of what you said here in a bit, but thank you very much. Marty Elder.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'm Marty Elder. I'm an independent consultant here in Bozeman, and I provide services and direct support to small businesses who are technology-based. I've worked with the university technology transfer officers, with TechLink, and I'm here today as part of the Montana Department of Commerce MTIP program. This is Montana Technology Innovation Partnership, and we promote the technology commercialization in the state of Montana. Now, we've already heard from the universities about the technology they're growing, and we've heard about the economic development that comes out of launching good technology. I'm going to refocus attention on that gap in between, which is commonly known as the Valley of Death. And this is where small companies are struggling to survive until they can achieve technology maturity and generate sales revenue. Now, keep in mind that most of our small technology companies are founded and operated by scientists and engineers. And while they're brilliant people, they are not necessarily well prepared for launching businesses, particularly at a large scale. So this time span, which can last several years, can be challenging, and it can be many years before a business becomes eligible for commercial, conventional types of funding sources like loans and outside investments, and for services and business planning that will be meaningful to them as they get out of this very early stage. The development of novel technology requires a support structure that includes both financial backing and access to specialized technical assistance services. It truly takes a community to raise innovation to the point where we can expect returns in the form of products and services and jobs. I have 5 challenge areas I'd like to bring to attention, and of course the first one has to do with this problem of the stalemate on SBIR reauthorization, which is now coming into its 14th continuing resolution, I believe. This is the single biggest source of seed funding for our Montana small technology companies, and yet the program is continuing to operate in enormous uncertainty. Additionally, the state's MBRCT program has not been funded forward significantly, and we have lost yet another source of seed funding within this state. Secondly, we need program support funding for expert technical services to remain available. Services have been seriously eroded over the last couple of years. Our companies require technical expertise that they can ill afford to hire. But that is vital for sharing best practices and for locating and securing opportunities and strategic partnerships. One example of support funding is the Small Business Administration Federal and State Technology Partnership Program that's known as FAST. Future funding for this program tied up in the SBI reauthorization. Third point, in 2009, a Senate Commerce Committee investigation resulted in demands for sharper scrutiny of small business fiscal accountability in the SBIR program. While this is appropriate, it set in motion substantial audit activity without any constraints on how long an auditor can shut down a contract, even in the absence of meaningful findings, or even without being responsive to company efforts at compliance. Contracts important to federal program managers are being tied up for months, some in excess of a year. Just this week, I was contacted by a California company with their contract problems. They're going to be laying off high-paid jobs because of indefinite delays on their SBIR contract audits. My fourth suggestion comes in light of the New America Invents Act. This puts new stress on our technology businesses to file patents earlier and to radically revise their patent-related behavior. We need field services and program support to small companies to address patenting and patent strategies. These needs could be fulfilled by a state patent a loan fund, or even by field services that could come from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Finally, at every opportunity, we need to continue to dedicate training and awareness programs within the economic development community to address the distinctively different support requirements for nurturing innovation and technology-based businesses to get them through this valley of death. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. We'll go to John O'Donnell.
Thank you, Senator Tester, for hosting this roundtable and for allowing me to speak. It's great to be here. I wanted to say at the onset, last week I was in North Carolina for a full week at a conference in the Research Triangle that was hosted by Credit Suisse for small and emerging managers in in-state mandated programs for venture capital. And it's really amazing to see what happened in North Carolina and how 20, 30 years ago, they made this conscious decision that they were not going to, their future was not going to be tied to tobacco and furniture. And Liz is nodding because she's been there. I mean, it's amazing. I was blown away by what was going on in North Carolina, and it just seems like there's so many things that we could, lessons learned that we could apply here, both in the supporting the entrepreneurs through things like incubation, and also by providing capital access, better access to capital. So I wanted to provide that quick backdrop. The next part that I'd like to talk about is I feel like a broken record, but I do think that this, the challenge for Montana is, it's really, from my perspective, it's after the research at the university, and it's that gap that Marty talked about, that Becky talked about, whether it's financial gap or if it's having a proof of concept centers and incubators and things like that. I think we're deficient in both of those areas, and I think it's something that we need to really get on top of. I can say that through direct experience. 10 years ago, I moved to Montana and started up the Tech Ranch, and due to lack of funding, Tech Ranch no longer has a physical facility. There is no entrepreneur center in Bozeman, Montana. And you know, I think that's crazy, right? I mean, we have this great research university, we have this amazing quality of life, we've got companies like Right Now Technologies and Ligosite that have proved it can happen here, and to not have an entrepreneur center, having just come back from North Carolina, and where you can see these things frequently, it seems crazy. Now, I understand the federal budgets are tough, and my one suggestion would be, we have tried to go after some EDA money, and we have been thrown out on technicalities recently for being the Bozeman area doesn't qualify sometimes because of our per capita income is too high or our unemployment rate is too low. And it seems kind of crazy that we couldn't qualify for some of those kind of EDA grants that are going around right now. The second recommendation or thought would be any assistance that your office could provide in making introductions to private sector, private foundations. I know the Kauffman folks are here today, but maybe it's time for entrepreneur center incubation type things to begin to look more to the private sector, given the federal and state constraints around budgets. Just in conclusion on that topic, I hope that we can figure out a way to solve the problem and get entrepreneur centers going, not only in Bozeman again. I'm still doing things virtually. I'm meeting with entrepreneurs at coffee shops around town. I've drank more caffeine in the last 3 months and spent more money at the local coffee shops. But there's some really interesting and cool startup companies around here, and they're dying for people to talk to. It's amazing to me how these guys are coming in and they're looking for feedback and they're looking for advice and they're looking to get connected. And they're wandering around aimlessly and in their garage talking to their dog all day long, and they want to have a place to go and confer. The second part of my discussion is on the, I guess, on the funding issue. I am a partner in a Seattle-based fund. We're actually a little bit later stage than venture capital, but I am on the board of the Rocky Mountain Venture Capital Association. I know the venture capital world well. And when going to North Carolina and going to this conference last week, I have to think we're one of the only states in the country that does not have some sort of a program. And there are people who tell you we have to have a program, it's the only thing that's going to save us, and they don't know what they're talking about. And there are people on this end of the thing that says it's the dumbest idea in the world, we should never put that money at risk, and they don't necessarily know what they're talking about either. I think there's a hybrid model in the middle where you can have mandated programs, in-state mandates, without being so restrictive that the money's going to just blow up and go away, but also not being so loose that the money just flows out of state. I'd be happy to spend time talking with you and your staff on ideas. And the one other idea that's the broken record concept is I do think the solution could be in a regional strategy. And so my recommendation is getting together with some of the leaders in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, maybe some of the other states, and saying, let's talk about a fund of funds and some sort of a regional mandated program. And sometimes I just think it's a matter of getting that first sheep through the gate. Mm-hmm. And if we want to lead that, get that conversation going, perhaps others will jump in and have a regional strategy.
Okay. Well, thanks, John. Thank you very much. Evan Barrett.
Well, in the 25 years I've been doing economic development, it's pretty clear that you want to make such stuff happen, you got to put some green on the table. And that's kind of what this is about, is talking about capital formation. And in the public sector in Montana, there's a bit of a challenge. We have a constitutional limitation on taking public monies and applying them into private uses. And it's been adjudicated by the Supreme Court, so it makes the utilization of state money awkward at best. We don't have the same constraint when it comes to federal money, but there's a limiting amount of that. But to give a context to what we mean, if you $1 million of state money into a program is the equivalent of $2.25 billion in the federal budget. So while the numbers we talk about in Montana appear to be small numbers, it's all relative. And so you take the research and commercialization, $3.6 million is, it's the equivalent of $8 billion federally. So that's kind of the way I think we have to look at these things. The programs Montana has had in place, I think have been pretty successful given the small amount of resource. And research and commercialization programs, although that's down and underfunded right now, it goes back up to full funding in the next cycle, the next budgetary cycle, to $3.65 million per year. That's equivalent to that $8 billion. It's funded 181 projects, 337 million over the period of time it's been in existence, leveraged 42 million, brought on 230 million of follow-on funding. The MTIP program, which the SBIR, STTR support program, that's only $50,000 a year in general fund money right now, with some additional small business money thrown in to help make it happen with the contracts on the side. But there have been 326 SBIR awards in that much time. It averages about 8.5 million a year, 85 million over that period in SBIR funding. Again, that seems like a lot. By the way, in recent years, it was 9.4 million in 08, 8.6 in 09, 10.4 million in 2010. So while it averages 8.5, it's been more than that in recent years. Assisted about 350 businesses. So these are things that kind of work. When you look at us in comparison to other Western states, for example, we're fourth in the number of SBI awards. If you take California out of the mix, we're fourth highest in SBIR awards, and we're second in a per capita basis in terms of SBIR. So my point, Senator, is that we don't have a lot of money, but we're doing a lot with it. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to leveraging and making these things happen. And so what can we do? Now, by the way, we did create in the last two sessions a new program on SBIR matching support, which was funded and was put in place in 2009, but an empty vessel with no money. And we just put $750,000 of money in it in the last days of the session this time. And we're kind of toying with, till we get the budget done, about $1 million a year into this in the future. Now, what is that million? We anticipate that $750,000 will leverage about 15 million of activity, about 20 to 1. And so if we're putting 2 million in, we're going to be at about 40 million. Let me just say the recommendations that if we want to talk about it from a policy perspective, small business set-asides don't cost money, they're just set-asides. They have to be retained. So SBIR doesn't cost more money, it's just making sure small business gets it. STTR is the same. And so we have to fight to keep those set-asides in place. In addition, we need to look at the SBIR, STTR programs in the same way we look at the EBSCOR program, that you not only have a tilt to small business, but we should have a tilt to small states. If we want to diversify and spread the economy around around the nation right, it can't all go to where the big money is now. So I think that may not be easy to get done, but it's a policy objective, going from just a small business set-aside, but also to a small state emphasis. Will be something that would be very helpful. And again, if the stuff comes here, the proof's in the pudding, comes to states like Montana, you'll get a lot more bang for the buck.
Well, thank you, Evan. John Tyler.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for inviting me and the Kauffman Foundation to be here today, and thank you for holding these sessions on the importance of university innovation and their contributions to job creation and economic growth. Your interest is very much appreciated. A lot has been said already about the fantastic contributions of universities and university commercialization. And with limited time, I want to acknowledge that there's fabulous things that have been done in the last many decades, even preceding Bayh-Dole. And what I'd like to do is get to the recommendations that I have. And the recommendations are guided by federal policy, both in Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weidler. The federal policy is seeking to ensure the use of university inventions, seeking to ensure commercialization and public availability, protecting the public against non-use of inventions, and in the legislative history for Bayh-Dole, seeking to stimulate a greater return on the billions of dollars spent on research and development programs. The Stevenson-Weidler Act, which applies to federal research labs, declared a strong national policy supporting utilization of the science and technology resources of the federal government. utilization of the resources. So the recommendations that I would suggest to encourage more towards achieving these purposes, there are 5 of them. The first one has to do with metrics and reporting. Common sociology tells us that what you measure is the behavior you will get. Behavior follows metrics. A lot of what is measured in the area of tech transfer, and these things should be measured and they're important, but they're not the be-all and end-all of what behavior should be. So measuring revenues, making decisions that are revenue-based. That you measure revenues, you drive behavior. Measuring the number of licenses, measuring spin-outs. Again, these are things that are appropriate to measure, but you get the corresponding behavior that limits activities or more narrowly has a tendency to limit activities to those purposes. Why not measure jobs? Why not measure the number of lives saved, the number of lives affected? Why not measure the number of products that a particular innovation is used in? Why not measure the number of users or the number of collaborations that come out of a particular innovation? Changing the metrics, adding to the metrics, will likely change behavior. And I think that there are ways the federal government can do this with, at least with funding agencies, NIH, NSF, and others, and the data that they can collect and can expect. So along the way of changing behavior would be looking at alternative pathways. Given Bayh-Dole's stated emphasis on patenting, there has been generally in universities, and my comments are general observations, not specific to Montana institutions. But generally, there is an overemphasis on patenting and licensing as the pathway for technology transfer. It is not the only pathway if the goal is to advance human welfare and advance economic growth. There are other pathways as well, and including, and a couple of my colleagues have advocated for free agency, that university researchers should be able to own the technologies. A variation of that would be university researchers being able to have the ownership revert to them, or at least the use rights and control revert to them. The university doesn't do things after a certain period of time, or after disclosure, or various other milestones. Open source could be critical, and I agree with Dr. Paulson's observations earlier. Open source for pharma and biomed probably doesn't work, in fact may be counterproductive. But open source for engineering and other technologies may be right on the money. I also agree that more expansive opportunities to work regionally or maybe with industry clusters, industry-focused tech transfer or advancing innovation initiatives could be excellent. Another recommendation would be looking at policy or at liability. If you're going to ask universities to put more out into the public, what liability are they taking on because they're putting those things out there? And perhaps there needs to be a policy that in some ways limits liability so that it encourages open source activities. As a smaller matter, there's policy confusion in the federal government. You've got the Internal Revenue Code, which says 501c3 organizations shouldn't be engaging in the for-profit sector. Universities shouldn't be engaging in the for-profit sector. You've got a federal policy that says universities must engage with the for-profit sector. And the IRS then sends questionnaires to 400 universities, hammering them on their tech transfer, their commercialization efforts. There ought to be a coherent declaration that they're not inconsistent and that they can work together. And finally, and this is a little bit off the topic of tech transfer, but it relates to knowledge transfer, and that is the benefits of a knowledge transfer that comes through highly skilled immigrants. Kaufman's studies and studies of others, including some of the work that I've done, has pointed to the fact that 25% of tech startups in Silicon Valley, 25% of biomed startups in Massachusetts, 25% of publicly traded companies with venture backing have been started by highly skilled immigrants. This compares against their presence in the population of 12%. That's immigrants' presence in the population, 12%. You look at highly skilled immigrants, it's not just a 2x variation, it's 3 to 4x. So there are ways to encourage highly skilled immigrants to be able to stay in the United States, to be able to start companies, grow companies, and create jobs. And I've got more about the tech transfer observations in an article the Journal Tech Transfer just published that I wrote. And then the immigration comments are in another article I've got for you, and there are some for others as well, that Peter Shook from Yale and I published.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the information. Trevor Lloyd.
Thank you, Senator Tester, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. As you mentioned, my name is Trevor Lloyd. I'm the founder and general partner of a seed and early stage investment firm called Flywheel Ventures. I'm also a member of the board of directors of the National Venture Capital Association, which represents over 400 VC firms across the U.S. and over 90% of all the VC capital in the country. I'm pleased, by the way, to be joined today in the audience by my colleague, Clyde New. Clyde, raise your hand, please. Clyde represents Flywheel Ventures in Montana and across the Northern Rockies. He's a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Montana and a former venture-backed serial entrepreneur himself. Since 2002, Flywheel's invested over $40 million of equity capital in 36 startups across the American West, including Montana. 2/3 of those investments have been in companies with origins in our region's research universities and our federal labs. We are always the first investor, at least the first professional institutional investor, often coming in alongside of or just after angel investors. And our typical initial investments are $50,000 to $500,000 with the ability to provide up to $3 million after that. So we're trying to address that very gap that many people have spoken about today. Senator Tester, the importance of venture capital-fueled entrepreneurship to the U.S. economy cannot be overstated. U.S.-based companies that receive venture capital investment now account for $3.1 trillion of our GDP. That's about 21% of our GDP. These companies employ 12 million workers in the United States, and that's about 11% of all the private sector jobs in the United States. What's particularly amazing about those numbers is that the venture capital investment that created those companies is only 0.2% of GDP. So the return on that investment has been extraordinary. In my view, 4 elements are key to this unique and dynamic source of competitive advantage in the American economy. And those 4 elements are entrepreneurs, innovation, capital markets, and the macroeconomy. Of these 4 elements, in my view, entrepreneurs are clearly the most important. For domestic-born entrepreneurs, the key considerations are education and mobility. Ensuring widespread access to quality public K-12 education is the most essential thing we could do. And that includes increasing the emphasis on science and mathematics. Once those talented entrepreneurs are in the workforce, we must ensure their ability to change jobs easily and frequently. We should ensure favorable tax treatment for their stock and stock options for those who start or even work for startup companies. We should also ensure that health insurance policies encourage employees to join startup companies without jeopardizing their health care coverage, especially in the case where their families have pre-existing medical conditions. And the one aspect of the healthcare legislation that's unquestionably positive for the entrepreneurial community has been the elimination of pre-existing conditions as an exclusionary policy. We also need to provide nationwide, ubiquitous, and affordable broadband internet access. And we need efficient transportation networks, including air, rail, and highway infrastructure. And a particular concern for Montana, in my view, is the inadequate nature of your airport infrastructure and flight access, both in terms of getting to Montana, but also in terms of traveling among the cities once you're here. And I can talk more about that. There's a great deal more thought in my written testimony that I've submitted to your staff. Ensuring that America remains the global magnet for all entrepreneurs, including those born elsewhere, is also essential. As John said, we believe immigrants, and particularly high-skilled immigrants, are a key part of this formula. And I have some additional data to add on the ones you shared. Of all private VC-backed companies in 2006, 47% were started by immigrants to this country, almost half. Of all public U.S. companies that received venture investment in the past 20 years, as John, I think, also shared, 25% of these were founded by immigrants. Of all U.S. high-tech and engineering companies started between 1995 and 2005, not just those backed by venture capitalists, 25% of those were started by immigrants. And finally, perhaps most stunningly, more than 40% of Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants or their children. As Mayor Michael Bloomberg has stated, we are committing national suicide with our current national immigration policy. We need to expand the ratio of visas given for economic reasons instead of family reasons. Second, for all foreign students who complete engineering and science degrees at American universities, in order to get them to stay in the United States after they graduate, we should be stapling green cards to their diplomas. Finally, we should create a new category of visas for entrepreneurs who start their own companies, raise a meaningful amount of capital, and hire a minimum number of American workers. One such proposal for this is the Startup Visa, an initiative proposed by many venture capitalists, including myself, and more information on that is at startupvisa.com. The second main element of our entrepreneurial success has been the strength of our innovation and R&D system. As VCs, we are in the business of assessing the real-world applications and riskiness of research breakthroughs once they've been fully developed and proven. We will take the risk of translating innovations into commercial products. We will not take the basic scientific or technology risk. So it is critical that this activity has support from the government. It is precisely the role of these basic researchers, and I'm, to be clear, not talking about applied research. I'm talking about basic blue sky R&D at universities. And that's what leads, interestingly, to the most important life-changing and economically significant breakthroughs. As Isaac Asimov famously said, the most exciting phrase in science, the one that heralds the most important new discoveries, is not eureka, but rather, huh, that's funny. As one specific observation with regard to the SBIR program, particularly its importance in Montana and across the West, there's a continual fight that you may know about where in the misguided name of protecting small businesses, the U.S. small business lobbying organizations have tried to make companies that receive SBIRs ineligible from then pursuing venture capital funding, or vice versa. If you get VC money, you can't get an SBIR. If you get an SBIR, you can't get VC money. Those policies don't make sense, particularly in a state like this where you need every dollar you can from every source you can get. And I'd encourage you to continue to help us push back on those initiatives. The third element of entrepreneurial advantage in the U.S. is our capital markets. And that debate over how to reverse and improve the growing stagnation of our U.S. capital markets, for smaller growth companies in particular, is a complex and technical one. So I will only summarize a few key recommendations. Providing a scaled-back Sarbanes-Oxley light for newly public companies with either a time window or a maximum company size limit would be especially helpful. Amending the Spitzer degree to allow banks to reemploy equity research analysts using revenues from their banking business while ensuring appropriate ethical guidelines is also important. A third suggestion is involving the private secondary exchange markets. Investors in our industry hold a wide variety of opinions on this topic because it's so new, but my personal recommendation is that the uncertainty around the viability and legitimacy of these secondary private exchange markets is itself the biggest challenge. So I would encourage the SEC to quickly review, decide, and publicly publish the rules of the game for private secondary exchange markets. I also have a number of tax policy recommendations. As a starting point, the current policy of reduced tax rates for capital gains from long-term equity investments in private companies should be maintained. An additional staggered or laddered reduction for even longer holding periods might provide additional incentive for those of us who provide patient capital to entrepreneurs trying to grow companies over a 5 to 10 year period or more. An outright exemption or at least a substantial tax holiday from all taxation on investments made in specially qualifying types of startup businesses would be effective. And finally, we should treat income received by startup company employees from equity stock options as capital gains and not ordinary income. The fourth and final element, in my view, is the stability of our broader macroeconomy. I'm not a macroeconomist and not an expert on many of the technical issues and debates among our economists today. And at the same time, there are several issues that directly affect our entrepreneurial economy. The most important, in my view, is the stagnation of housing values and the corresponding lack of credit flow in the mortgage market. In the interest of time, my written testimony contains specific observations about how that housing market stagnation is directly stifling entrepreneurial company formation. And I refer you to that. For those in the audience, that testimony is also posted on my blog at trevorlloyd.com. Senator Tester, your support for the entrepreneurial economy, both in Montana and nationwide, has not gone unnoticed by those of us in the national venture capital investment community. We very much appreciate both your past support and your continued focus on our further improvements, and I look forward to working with you, your staff, and all of the key players you've gathered in the room today. Thank you very much.
Well, Trevor, thank you very much, and I want to thank all the panelists for their testimony. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we're going to take about 10 minutes and cut a little into the break time to transition to the next panel. Many of you talked about things that need to be changed at the federal level to help facilitate tech transfer. Will talked about designating 1.5%. Trevor, you just got in talking about immigration policy, and there's been a lot in between. Very briefly, if you could give me one thing you'd change at the federal policy level to facilitate tech transfer, what would it be? And we can start and just go down the line if you can be very brief.
Well, I'd repeat my suggestion of a 1.5% set aside, like the SBR set aside in the federal agency and federal lab R&D budgets to make sure those inventions actually see the light of day in the marketplace.
Okay. Anybody else? Marty? John?
SBIR reauthorization.
Get it
Push that
reauthorized
one
on a long
home.
term? Okay. John?
I would agree with Marty.
Okay.
Well, again, just to reiterate what I said before, I think that if you use the EBSCOR model, which is tilts to the smaller states, and apply it to the other programs, it'll really help the situation out.
Okay. John?
The one item I would focus on is encouraging the additional pathways beyond the patent licensing model that Bayh-Dole is currently interpreted as encouraging, and including advocating for open source where it's most appropriate.
Okay.
So my view is a little different. I think it starts with entrepreneurs before money, and I think you need more entrepreneurs, and the fastest way to get more entrepreneurs is to get more immigrants in Montana and elsewhere, so I think startup visa and the related ideas.
Okay. Very good. Questions from the crowd? Yes, go ahead.
Just a comment to add on to Mr. O'Donnell's comments. I was in North Carolina last week as well, and I would add to what you're saying, that what they're doing is almost astounding economically. But what I got out of my trip is that they had a very energetic, smart leadership corps that weren't afraid to go onto the cutting edge, and they created their opportunities. They just didn't passively wait for them to come. So as we're talking about all this legislation, all these things around, I think a core thing is developing a identifiable leadership structure to move these things forward, like North Carolina and Charlotte and some of these others did as well.
My one comment would be, and what was interesting to me in North Carolina was the person who, at the conference where I was, that was really leading the discussion was the state treasurer.
Yeah, it's,
Can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
North Carolina, of course, I worked in 10 years in public policy for technology transfer primarily. 80% of the people in North Carolina are employed in the private sector. And Research Triangle Park started out primarily with 5 pharma companies being moved to North Carolina to take advantage of workforce. In Montana, we still have over half the people in the state employed in the public sector. So it creates a very different kind of collaborative culture. And the treasurer's there because she knows where checks are coming from.
She's bright.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Mr. Lloyd, I'm curious about your comment. I agree with you. It starts with entrepreneurs, but how do you not reconcile, but you're advocating immigrants, well-trained immigrants being able to come in and stay in this country for startups? What about education within this country? We hear a lot about the importance of elevating the quality of education, particularly in science and math. Is it really possible in this country to bring that education level up to the point and promote entrepreneurship at the same time that we can feed this need for entrepreneurs internally, as well as, I don't mean exclusive to or exclusive of immigrants. Can we do both?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. Both my oral and especially my written testimony makes clear that I think you have to do both. I would just point out that, we live in a global economy. Capital is going to flow instantaneously wherever in the world it can see the best return. And so where it will see the best return is with the best entrepreneurs. The best entrepreneurs are going to come from the most highly skilled people And those people are going to go wherever they see the environment most favorable to them starting companies. So I think we not only need to train our own so that we have a disproportionate share of the most highly skilled entrepreneurs in the world, as we historically have had, but we also need to make sure that, let's be clear, with only 3% of the population, we're not going to maintain that disproportionate lead forever, just demographically. So it's also essential that we retain the magnet of attracting all the skilled entrepreneurs from other countries, because we want them starting companies here and not Singapore.
Yeah.
So.
Rob?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I think, along those lines of reform, I think one of the key things that we can do here in the state is to increase our business acumen within our scientific community. In other words, our scientists need to be trained to be thinking about business and business opportunities as they move forward in the education process, giving them the opportunity to actually get experience and understanding what finance is, understand how to start a business, and have a sense of how to run a business. So I think a managerial program in the sciences is part of development.
Can I just say one thing on that? I helped to build a program that many of you know called the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. And interestingly, we started that program with seed funding from the Kauffman Foundation about 15 years ago. The website, just to promote it, I'm no longer involved other than I still teach there, but it's stvp.stanford.edu, and it was the first major program in the country at a major research university to specifically target entrepreneurship education at science and engineering students and not at business students. I believe strongly that entrepreneurship is a set of skills and a way of thinking about leadership. It is not a domain of business that should be taught in business school. It should be taught in every school as part of every curriculum: arts, medical, engineering, science, et cetera. And we just received a $10 million National Science Foundation grant with the specific purpose of taking that curriculum and transferring it to other research universities around the country. So to the extent I can help do that at the two universities, or the three main research universities here, I'd be happy to do that. So.
Thank you for that. Jerry?
It's interesting that the gentleman in the back pointed that out, because if you look at how other industries have handled this, chiropractic is an interesting one. Some schools teach chiropractic skills and chiropractic business. Some just teach chiropractic skills. There is a huge difference in the cumulative success of their graduates, as it were. And you can see them in certain areas where they build larger chiropractic empires. An argument that we've made here is that if we don't find a way to go from beyond a trickle-down approach to educating regions and the entrepreneurs, the graduates in those regions, to think about the end state of what they're inventing, we're going to fail the way Silicon Valley did. Silicon Valley's failure is pivotal in one area. They funded concepts. All of the venture firms I worked with, which there were over a dozen in startup companies, were funding a concept and didn't look at the other side of what we call the bow tie diagram to look at production, marketing, sales, technical support, and intermarket competition once the whole development period was done. Because they didn't evaluate this in due diligence, they actually created the product and then had no money to go through what would actually put the device or the product in the hand of the consumer. They were designing forward from an idea as opposed to saying, maybe we should design backward from the consumer of that idea. And there's some people who have taught some very critical things, which I'm sure Trevor is familiar with. Andy Hunt writes a book called Pragmatic Programming and Learning. It's how to rework your head. It's not really for programmers, but the one sentence you take out of that is about how it applies in the nursing industry, and it says this: think forward, design backwards. That's absolutely critical to everything we do here in entrepreneurialism and how we bring this up in our town, in our region, to get people to think from the other end, from the solved end of the problem. So that's a thought that I think is
Does
really
anybody want to comment on it? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, in some ways, that point, the point that you made, and Trevor, your point, I would argue it's not necessarily, and particularly with scientists, with engineers as distinguished from chiropractors, it's not necessarily just understanding business concepts and how to run a business. It's having exposure to opportunities to understand, and this is to your point, in part the end in mind, what's the opportunity that might exist? What is the need in society that I could maybe solve with this research that I'm doing, that not even thinking about it? And that's where collaborations with industry can be very, very important. Some sabbaticals, some internships, some give and take going back and forth can be critical to those, including effective business principles.
We'll do one more. Gary, you're at.
Yeah, I recently read that, in the global economy, we have $1.2 quadrillion invested in derivatives, notational value derivatives, which represents was involved in a consortium to help try to create transparency in the capital markets through XBRL. And, my sense, as I've grown up, is, through my life, is that capital used to flow, and I think you mentioned something about this, capital really should be flowing to where it's needed most within the society. And capital, in a productive society, flows towards those things which are profitable and which are needed by the economy. Increasingly, what I've seen happen is capital flows towards more like a gambling casino whose sole end game is to produce profit at no valuation and no benefit to society. And we've seen the compression of wealth over 30 years. We've seen the lack of the middle class lifestyle, and this discussion about the lack of capital is directly tied to the fact that productive capital is taken out of the system and increasingly compressed into small number of hands, and an enormous risk to everyone, which you just experienced. And I just wonder on the Senate, what is keeping the Senate from passing really significant legislation that, number one, makes the derivatives market transparent, and number two, really helps to make some regulations that help capital to be productive rather than capital flowing to gigantic gambling casinos?
Well, I think you touched on the whole problem with the meltdown, 3.5 years ago, about folks turning Wall Street into Las Vegas and really making bets on instruments that were worthless. Look, Dodd-Frank, once it gets implemented, its intent was to provide more transparency. Whether that comes to fruition or not, I don't know. We'll see as it gets opened up. But as with a lot of issues in Washington, D.C., it won't be the last time we address it. And I think it's going to be really important that the folks that have a true understanding about the financial industry and not in a way where they want to manipulate it, because there's plenty of those, talk about what really needs to happen from a policy standpoint in Washington, D.C., so we can get those ideas back there. The folks in Washington, D.C., it's important to know they want to do the right thing, but they got to have good information to be able to make the right decision. Evan, and then we'll close it off.
Yeah, it's kind of piggybacking a little bit on this. We talk a lot about the federal money and where the state money and all that stuff. Driving private money is what this is about. The private side's got a lot more to contribute to the green that has to go on the table to make things happen. And I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say to you, I hope you have the opportunity to vote to change the tax laws in this country, which push money out of the United States to other places, so that money, they chase profitability, and we have actually laws that make it easier to make your money by sending it overseas. And in the meantime, we're trying to import immigrants here with high skills. So part of this is in the tax solution, and I know if the opportunity presents itself, you'll be really appropriate.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks, Evan. Thanks for the vote of confidence. I would just say, as with the previous panel, I want to thank the participants here. Did a great job. We obviously need several more hours to flesh out many of these issues, because they're far more. They can be far more in depth than we've touched on it. I want to thank you all. And I didn't do this well enough with the first panel, so those guys that are here appreciate it. But I want to thank you all for your recommendations and your time that you've taken to be here.